We can create models of reality in the mind, which is a transcendental capacity of the mind, writes Maria Popova, who runs an extraordinarily wonderful literary online magazine called The Marginalian. This tendency, in its clinical manifestation, is called delusion. But in its creative manifestation, it's called art. The novel, poetry, short story, and all of it. The writer creates a world not as it is, but as he thinks it is. And he invites the reader to step into that world. He wants you to understand the world and also understand who you are. In its self-gained momentum, the story at times crosses the terrain of imagined existence, surprising the writer himself. In his celebrated work, The Art of the Novel, Milan Kundera speaks about the first draft of Leo Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. And he says, in the first draft of Anna Karenina, Anna was an unsympathetic, cruel woman, and the tragic end was something that she deserved and justified. However, the final draft of the novel was much different from how it was in its first draft. So Milan Kundera writes, and I read, I do not believe that Tolstoy had revised his moral ideas in the meantime. I would say, rather, that in the course of writing, he was listening to another voice than that of his personal moral conviction. He was listening to what I would like to call the wisdom of the novel. Every true novelist listens for that supra-personal wisdom, which explains why great novels are always a little more intelligent than their authors. He says, novelists who are more intelligent than their books should go into another line of work. Recognizing this wisdom of uncertainty, Milan Kundera says, the novel is the imaginary paradise of individuals. In this terrain, truth is not possessed by anyone, neither Anna nor Karenine, but they both have the right to be understood, both Anna and Karenine. Therefore, I believe that the storyteller's role is to make us realize the doom and glory of who we are. Having said that, I personally believe that the creative process is something to be mysterious. I believe that it's fragile. I believe that an overexposure of the creative process is harmful both to the reader's intelligent and the writer's creative process. I always associate it with a metaphor that often comes to my mind, which is when you go to the temple, when they bathe the god, when they decorate the god, they draw the curtains, they close the door. They open the door only after the god is there for you in all his glory. So I believe that the creative process has to be mysterious, has a lot remains unsaid in the creative process, and I hope in this conversation with Vivek, we will keep those mysteries intact, and we will also uncover some of the key things about the creative process. I also want to say that in this conversation, the attempt is to get Vivek to talk about some of his key thoughts, his personal, emotional, intellectual urgencies that shape his craft, and none of what we talk are a discussion of the merit of the works that he has written. Vivek, it's a pity that we are not talking in Kannada. And in my head, I'm imagining that we are talking in Kannada. So because they have called this session, How Does a Story Begin? Let's start with that question. How does a story begin?
I think there are two phases or two stages where the story begins, or two aspects. One is where the seed of the story is sown inside me. And I think that is very important because it triggers certain strings of thoughts, emotions, and also it creates a kind of a, it may be an image, it may be a picture, it may just be a character, it may just be a phrase. And it is little bit mysterious, abstract. I think that is the first phase, and it grows. And then there is a second part of it, which is actually the art of writing, where I try to capture this abstract into words. I'll come to the second part a little later, but the first is where it goes on accumulating more details, more characters, more, because it is something which I have not understood and which is very, which I am grappling with. And if I am lucky, I move on to the next stage very quickly, but then it doesn't happen. Sometimes it just happens like that, sometimes it doesn't happen, and then it accumulates over a period of time. Then comes a point where I try to understand it, as I said, from abstract to reality, and try to find an entry point into that world. And that to me is very important because that defines the voice, the tone of the work, whether it's a story or a novel or anything. And it is like fixing a camera. You fix that point, and you, from that position, you see certain things, and more importantly, you don't see certain things. And to find that point, at times it takes days, sometimes even years. And which is when we say, or at least I say, the story was in me for many years, many days or many weeks. It is because it is there because I have not been able to find an entry into that space. The second one is relatively easier because then what we call the beginning of a story. And I think it is a lot to do with art. While it is a lot to do with art, but also it is a point from where you can string all those abstract things in a meaningful manner, or at least in a manner which makes meaning to me as a writer. Sometimes it may not, it is even beyond me, as you just now said. So these are the two ways in which a story begins in my mind. And always, believe me, there are so many stories running in my mind, always. So it is a continuous process, and the second one is more of hard work, more of perseverance, more of, because that something which is there, which is abstract, you keep trying, and many times it just escapes, and that is what is the effort, and that is through the language. Many times the language helps to capture that thing, because everything has to be realized, unfortunately, in a language. But then the first part, the first beginning, the first space that is created in my mind is, many times it may not just be language.
I remember two things. One is Murakami talking about how the story begins. He said his first story came to him when he was playing baseball. And he just left the game, went home and wrote his story. And the other thing that comes to my mind is Pamuk talking about his process of writing. That he donned a different persona. He went out of his home every morning at 9, like he was going to work. And then he would go out and come back and open the door of his house as a different Pamuk the writer, and start writing. So it is indeed a magical moment, and a writer has to be fortunate enough to get that magical moment. Like I remember Anantmurthy's lines. He's saying, Adrishta onde iddare salatu. He says in one of his poems, it's not enough to just be fortunate, it should manifest in you. So does every story have a new beginning, or are the beginnings of every story different? For instance, if you, does form define the beginning? Suppose you set out to write a novel, or you set out to write a play, or you set out to write a short story. Are these beginnings different? Are they same? How does it work?
I think for every form and for every story, the beginnings are different. Beginnings are different because what you are, as I said, what triggers in you and how quickly and how fast one can string them all together and how fast one can get entry into it is what matters. And sometimes when one is lucky, that you get it very fast, but all the time a writer has to keep knocking on the door. And I think that comes from experience and from reading, from thinking, from interactions with others. So many things. It's all part of, reading is also part of writing. Because it sharpens your mind, it opens up many doors. So you keep knocking on the door and it happens. So every story, every beginning is a different beginning. Every poem, and I think it is a lot to do with the form. Also because one cannot just sit down and write a novel. While I have written down stories like that there is, what you call sometimes inspiration or whatever you call. So I have done that a couple of times, but not always. If one is lucky, then it flows in that manner. But then one can't hope to do that with a novel. So form does play a role in one's mind when you begin to work. Because see, it has to happen physically in the real world. So there are certain physical limitations. And as Meera was talking, it's a lot of physical work. It is physical work.
Okay. Vivek, writers are supposed to have or are said to have role models. Did you have role models? And who were they? Were you trying to write like them?
I used to read a lot when I was very young. And my first story was written when I was 16 and it was published. It got a prize in a story competition. But at that time, I was thinking that literature is about, one need to have a lot of experience, one need to travel the world, one need to, there's so many things have to happen to you for one to be a writer. And one day I came across Yashwant Chittal's stories. Yashwant Chittal is one of Kannada's great writers who happens to be from the same district and same place as I come from. His mother tongue is also Konkani. And so I read his stories, and it was by chance because I was just reading without knowing any, I was just reading. So I came across his stories, and I was surprised that his stories were all about the people around whom I see every day, and details were, what I see every day. And suddenly it opened up a new world for me. I felt that one need not travel the world. Everything is around you, and there is a need to look at it in a different way. And I was so impressed that I wrote to him. I did not know him. I wrote to him and said that, I liked your this, that. And then he responded to me. And he said, I am coming to his native place, which is Hanehalli, which is, in every one of his stories and novels, this place Hanehalli appears. It is like a Yaknopata of Faulkner or Kambar's Shivapura. So he said, I'm coming to visit that place, and I will see you when I'm there. And he did visit, and then he took me along to his village. And one of his very famous stories is Abolin, in which an innocent girl is married to crook in a village. And that happens because he kisses her and he tells her that you are pregnant. And the girl has no mother, and this man tells her this, and Abolin goes and tells her father. And father, it's a small village, and then the priest in the church asks her father to come and see, and all that happens. And then father asks her, "Are you pregnant?" She says yes, because she doesn't know. She's the most beautiful girl in the village and most innocent. And then this happens. And then this guy, the villain, is called Kaitan. Her father is called Kaitan. And I remember the way Chittal described, after he meets the priest, he comes down the steps of the church with such a heavy heart. And so on and so forth. And similarly, there is another story of Chittal, which is about death. About an old man going from one end of the village to the other end of the village, and it's raining, and there is this lightning, and the description is, when there is lightning, you see whatever he sees is what is described as in the story. So as he moves, there is a lightning, and the story is about death, and the whole story is about the movement of this old man from one end of the village to the other end of the village. So I went with him very excited and wanted to see the church. He said, here is the one, here is this church that appeared in Abolin. And in my mind, the church was like a huge building, and the steps were endless. Yeah. And I go and see that there's some tiny building, some 5-feet building of church. And I was so disappointed. There are only 3 steps. And then he took me through that path in which the old man went, which was like an eternal road in the rain and in the dark. And it was like hardly 1 furlong. But there was a very important lesson that I learned, that what is a physical space and what is a literary space. What does, how to see the world through the lens of literature. And I think he influenced me a lot. And I think this was something that I will never forget. And it was like, I cannot express how it was, but it was like this. In a flash of a moment, it was a kind of epiphany. It just happened to me. And considering that, I would say he is one writer who influenced me a lot in many, many ways. And I tried to imitate him, because it is so easy to imitate a writer who has a similar background. I have a similar experience. It was so easy. And then after writing a couple of stories, once I was complimented by editor of Mayura, and saying that you write so well, you write like Yashwant Chittal. And I was very shocked, because whatever it is, I don't want to write like someone else. And then I consciously, from that point onwards, I consciously worked on my script, on my stories. And I had already read Chittal, and I knew what were the specific phrases Chittal used, what were the words that he had used. And I started removing and cutting them out. And it gave me my own language, because you remove a word and you want to put your own thing. Then you have to think about the sentence, you have to think how does it fit in. So that exercise of eliminating Chittal from my language or from my stories sort of gave me my own language. And Chittal is a great writer. I mean, my Ghachar Gochar is dedicated to him. And I respect him, and unfortunately he is not with us anymore. But he is one writer who influenced me in my early days in many, many ways. First, in terms of me imitating him. Second, also in the process of eliminating him from my mind and from my writings.
Because we are speaking of Chittal, let me remind you of one more thing that Chittal told you very early in your writing career. Most writers use psychoanalysis as a method for creative writing because it serves 2 purposes. One, to discover the world around them, and to discover their characters also. So in most of your early writings, particularly in Ankura and all of them, bodily desire was a central preoccupation in most of your writings. And you were looking at your world, all your characters through this prism. Chital writes a foreword for Ankura. And in that foreword, Chital says, here's a young writer, full of possibilities, a lot of hope for Kannada literature. But then he also says, I want to warn this writer of a few things. One is that he is carrying the legacy of the Navya tradition. And the Navya's preoccupation was the body. So he says, he is carrying that tradition, he's carrying that legacy without questioning. And what he actually needs to do is to look at the world in a political way. He has to examine our relationships, father, mother, brother, sister, husband, wife. He can examine these relationships in a political way, but for that, he needs to be politically incorrect. I want to request this writer to drop that tradition that he's carrying, the legacy that he's carrying without interrogation, and look at these possibilities. I want to ask you two things, Vivek. Did you think that Chital's suggestion or advice or warning made a huge impact on your writing? And why was the bodily aspect of human nature central to your early works?
Chitta's comment made, it is the only time I got a foreword written by someone. It was my first collection and Chittal and to none of my other books. And I respect him a lot, and I took his suggestion very seriously. Because I thought that, that is something which he was right in saying it. And I must look at the world in a different way. And coming to your second question, it is, in my childhood, I used to read a lot of books on Adhyatma, on spirituality. And because I felt as a teenager, it was a very complex thing, and one wants to conquer that complexity. At a young age, you like things to be very complex. Similarly, I was very much interested in mathematics because it was, very complex. So those things were challenged me, and I was very much into it. And then there was a point in time when I moved away from it completely and moved, and I believe it was for my good that I moved into reading more of literature. And so there was a time when I think the spirituality and the kind of books, they are all about self. That they make it more and more complex about the self and the relationship with something that is abstract and unknown. And maybe, and also because it was a time when the Navya movement was at its peak, and that, seeing the world through the body was also at its peak. And I come from a very conservative family. And for me, one of the ways was talking openly and reading or expressing about body was something which was like a rebelling against. So all these things made an impact, and which is why my first collection was all about body. It was a kind of a response to my conservative background. It was a kind of response to what I was reading, and also the Navya movement at that point in time. And then I moved away, and as probably, I don't want to go into the details, but then rest of my collections or the rest of the writing then on was completely of different nature. And I tried to understand, even in relationships, it was, a lot was inward, a lot was about self. And later on, it moved to the wider world.
You use language, at least to me, I feel that you use language in a very interesting, curious kind of way. You use many Kannadas in any literary form, whether you're writing a play or whether you're writing a novel. So suddenly there is a character who's speaking Havyaka, suddenly there's a character who's speaking North Karnataka Kannada. So in a way, I feel you use language to create drama. It's a matter of craft, it's a matter of technique. But in one of your interviews, I remember you commenting that you use language to explore the swabhava of a character, the personality. And you say after a point, you should drop language. Language should not become your preoccupation to discover swabhava. You should go deeper in your investigation into the swabhava. My question is, in investigation of swabhava, the writer's own swabhava poses a limitation. How do you deal with it? That's the first part of my question.
See, my mother tongue is Konkani. And Kannada to me is a language which is slightly outside of me. And the reason why I'm saying slightly outside is because there are many Kannadas. All Kannadas are my Kannadas.
Right.
For example, for Chandrasekhar Kambar, who was here with us this morning, Uttar Karnataka Kannada is his Kannada. He can't write North Karnataka Kannada. He'll be false if he writes. But I won't be false if I write North Karnataka Kannada. Mm. And that is because my mother tongue is not
Kannada.
Not Kannada. My mother tongue is Konkani. For all Kannada, all different types of Kannada is my Kannada. Also because I lived a few years in North Karnataka, I'm very comfortable with that Kannada. And also I explore, I use that Kannada to explore certain characters and Swabhava, as you said. Coming back to your question, the creator's Swabhava limits the, that's your question, right? Limits the Swabhava of a character. Actually, if that happens, then I think, to my mind, the writer has not succeeded. Mm. In the process, in the creative process, it is important for a writer to create characters and free them. And what is freeing them? Freeing them is to be able to create a character whose views are not the same as my views, whose ideology is not same as mine. Which is why I keep saying a writer should not be bound by an ideology. When I say that, what I mean is at the time of creation. Because if you don't free yourself from an ideology, you would want your characters to behave in a sanitized manner, in a manner in which you believe that a human being must react in a certain situation. But life has taught us that the people don't live in ideology. Life is not directed by an ideology. There are human situations, there are complex things, there are complex characters, there are people. So the way in which people respond, if I am a writer, I would really give myself, put my experience there, and allow those characters to just flourish and come and knock me down. And that is the pleasure of, somebody was, I think you were some time back mentioning, and Meera also mentioned it, pleasure of writing. Pleasure of writing is to see something and be surprised and shocked by what you have written. If it doesn't surprise you, if it doesn't shock you, then there is no pleasure of writing.
This is exactly what Milan Kundera calls the wisdom of uncertainty.
Yeah. And just let me finish. And it happens because we have that relationship with the language. And it happens only through the language. It cannot happen in my thought. Because the moment I start thinking that this character must behave like this, it doesn't happen. But at the time of creating a language with certain, whether it comes through description or through certain phrases or proverbs or a conversation between characters, it happens in the language. And that is the subtlety. And that is something, that can only happen through language. It cannot happen by my desire or by my will or by my, So that is where I feel that it goes beyond a writer.
Yeah. So, U.R. Anantmurthy at one point had said that if you don't give your character the free will to behave the way he wants to behave in a novel, and if you're controlling him all the time, that work will not be anything to speak about. Yeah. Vivek, can you talk about one or two challenges when your swabhava has limited and how you have overcome that challenge?
I would say in many of my works, for example, in Urubhanga, there is a character who is exactly opposite the character of the main protagonist or the narrator. Or in Ondubadi Kadalu, where there is I forgot the name of it. Yashwant
and Purandara.
Who are exactly opposite.
Polar opposites.
It's not that I have created them to be binary opposites, but then as the novel grows, they happen to be different people. So it happens every time. See, when you are inside, when I am inside a work, it is just that world that matters. And the details, and they just drive. And that freedom that you are talking about is just, I must just give myself and not bring that ideology. Or see, there are many times we feel the people must behave in a particular manner. We can't do that when you are writing, And one must accept it.
Right. How much time do we have?
We have.
How much time do we have? 7 minutes. Okay, shall I ask you this question and then will you?
Yeah.
Okay. Most of your Kannada readers identify you with one of your earlier collections, which is Huli Savari. It's almost become synonymous with your name, and also because you belonged to the corporate world, people associate you with that story. So this story, the title story of this collection, speaks of a global corporate world and the ruthlessness of a corporate game, which is like riding a tiger, no point of return. Your play, which came a few years after that, Sakare Gombe, not a global corporate world, but an Indian company, also speaks of a similar no point of return, Siddhartha being dragged into his family enterprise. So there is a certain taming, whether it is Siddhartha or Uche in Huli Savari. One hears these resonances even in your short story, Nirvana. I feel that you're saying two things. One is that this system wants types, not individuals. The other thing that you're trying to say is that resistances these days seem to have no steam. And though they will all seem like they're going to explode, even in your recent story, Krantivira Tarangidi. And in a play like Bahumukhi, you also say that how we hanker for a niralate, an undisturbed, cushy kind of life. Of course, characters like Yashwant, who are self-destructive in being non-conformist, come once in a while. What I want to ask you, Vivek, is that while you talk about a corporate world and its no point of return scenario, do corporations and societies, are they similar? Do they behave in a similar way? Is society very different from how corporations behave? Or are they similar in the way they behave?
See, I think in India, till about 30 years ago, the situation was different. The globalization has changed a lot. The language of corporates has seeped into our lives. And if you see, even language of politics has changed. People talk corporate language. In the politicians bring those terms. And we are talking about efficiency. We are talking about, they call, they want the chief minister to be the CEO or the prime minister to be the CEO. There's something fundamentally wrong in this. Because the core of corporate is profitability. And everything else is outside that. And to bring that terminology, bring that language into society, bring that language, and adopt that language to understand and assess our lives, our relationships. This is the disaster of last 25 years. This is the impact of globalization, apart from a lot of other things. So to come back to your question, I say yes. Now, unfortunately, this is what is happening, and I see it. I also have, spent decades in the corporate world and all over the not only in India but outside India. And so I feel that this is disastrous, because the kind of the primary motive are different, and and by normalizing it, we are giving a certain message, and the beneficiaries are corporations, and you can see it all over the world. And I don't want to get into the details, but the things are more, clear and evident.
Vivek, I think we will end the conversation here, but since we have very little time left, but would you read something from Kannada? There's this Mattobana Samsara, and my personal favorite is the title story. I think yours is Sharavana Services. My favorite is Mattobana Samsara, but I think you like Sharavana Services better.
This story is called, I'll read a few passages, couple of minutes. It's called Sharavana Services. This was written in 2005, and it's obviously services is what you know what services is, and it's set in Bangalore. And this guy Sharavana is the one who provides all kinds of services. ಇವತ್ತು ಬೇಡ ಸರ್, ಇವತ್ತು ಮಂಗಳವಾರ ಎಂದು ಶರವಣ ಹೇಳಿದಾಗ ನಾನು ಒಪ್ಪಿಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದು ಕೇವಲ ಅನುಕೂಲದ ದೃಷ್ಟಿಯಿಂದ. ಸಂಜೆಯೊಳಗೆ ಮುಗಿಸಬೇಕಾದ ಹಲವು ಕೆಲಸಗಳ ನಡುವೆ ಸೈಟ್ ನೋಡಲು ಶರವಣನ ಜೊತೆ ಹೋಗುವುದು ಸಾಧ್ಯವಿರಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಮಂಗಳವಾರ ಅನ್ನುವುದು ಅನುಕೂಲ ನೆವವಾಗಿದ್ದರಿಂದ ತಕ್ಷಣ ಹೂ ಅಂದೆ. ಆಡಿದ್ದು ನಿಜವೆನ್ನಿಸಲಿ ಎಂದು, ಅರೆ ಹೌದಲ್ಲ, ಕೆಲಸದ ನಡುವೆ ನನಗೂ ಮರೆತಿತ್ತು ನೋಡು ಎಂದೂ ಹೇಳಿಬಿಟ್ಟೆ. ಅದರ ನಂತರ ಶರವಣ 2 ದಿನಗಳಾದರೂ ಸೈಟು ನೋಡಲು ಹೋಗುವ ಮಾತೆತ್ತಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಇಲ್ಲವಾದರೆ ಬೆಳಗ್ಗೆ ಆಫೀಸು ಶುರುವಾಗುತ್ತಿದ್ದಂತೆ ಟೇಬಲಿನ ಮೇಲೆ ಚಾಯ್ ಇಡಲು ಬಂದ ಗಳಿಗೆಯಿಂದಲೇ ಅವನ ವ್ಯವಹಾರ ಶುರುವಾಗುತ್ತಿತ್ತು. ಇದೇ ಆಫೀಸಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಹಲವಾರು ವರ್ಷಗಳಿಂದ ಜವಾನನಾಗಿದ್ದ ಅವನು ಇತ್ತೀಚಿನ ದಿನಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಬ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಓಡಾಟ, ಆಫೀಸು ಉಸ್ತುವಾರಿಯಂತಹ ಅಷ್ಟಿಷ್ಟು ಹೆಚ್ಚಿನ ಜವಾಬ್ದಾರಿಯನ್ನು ವಹಿಸಿಕೊಂಡು ಕೆಲಸ ಉಳಿಸಿಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದ. ಆಫೀಸಿನ ಪ್ರತಿಯೊಬ್ಬರೂ ಒಂದಲ್ಲ ಒಂದು ರೀತಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಒಮ್ಮೆಯಾದರೂ ಅವನ ಜೊತೆ ವೈಯಕ್ತಿಕ ವ್ಯವಹಾರ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದರು. ಸೆಕೆಂಡ್ ಹ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ಫ್ರಿಜ್ ಬೇಕೇ, ಹಳೆಯ ಫ್ಯಾನ್ ಮಾರಬೇಕೆ, ಕಡಿಮೆ ಖರ್ಚಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಕಾರಿನ ಜಜ್ಜಿದ ಹಿಂಭಾಗ ಸರಿಪಡಿಸಬೇಕೆ, 5 ರೂಪಾಯಿಗೆ ಒಂದು ಮೊಳೆಯ ಹಾಗೆ ಮನೆಯ ಗೋಡೆಗಳಿಗೆ ಡ್ರಿಲ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಚಿತ್ರ ನೇತು ಹಾಕುವ ಕಾರ್ಪೆಂಟರ್ ಬೇಕೆ, ಅವನಿಗೆ ಹೇಳಿದರೆ ಸಾಕು. ಬೆಂಗಳೂರಲ್ಲಿ ಸೈಟ್ ಬೇಕಾದರೆ, ಅದರ ಕಾಗದ ಪತ್ರಗಳನ್ನು ಪರಿಶೀಲಿಸಲು ವಕೀಲರು ಬೇಕಾದರೆ, ಮನೆ ಕಟ್ಟಲು ಕಾಂಟ್ರಾಕ್ಟರ್ ಬೇಕಾದರೆ, ಗುದ್ದಲಿ ಪೂಜೆಗೆ ಪುರೋಹಿತರು ಬೇಕಾದರೆ ಅವನಿದ್ದಾನೆ. ನಾಡಿಶಾಸ್ತ್ರದ ಪಂಡಿತರನ್ನು ನೋಡಬೇಕೆ, ವಾಸ್ತು ಪರಿಣಿತರು ಬೇಕೆ, ಬಾಬಾ ದರ್ಶನಕ್ಕೆ ಹೋಗಬೇಕೆ, ಶಾಸ್ತ್ರೋಕ್ತ ಪೂಜೆಗೆ ನಿಮ್ಮದೇ ಒಳಜಾತಿಯ ಜನ ಬೇಕೆ, ಅವನ ಬಳಿ ಹೋದರೆ ಆಯಿತು. ಮಾತೃಭಾಷೆ ಯಾವುದು ಎಂದು ಗೊತ್ತೇ ಆಗದಷ್ಟು ಸರಾಗವಾಗಿ ಕನ್ನಡ, ತೆಲುಗು, ತಮಿಳು, ಹಿಂದಿಯನ್ನು ಮಾತಾಡುತ್ತಿದ್ದ. ತಡವರಿಸಿದರೂ ತಪ್ಪಾದರೂ ಅವನ ಇಂಗ್ಲೀಷ್ ಅರ್ಥವಾಗುತ್ತಿತ್ತು. 2 ದಿನಗಳ ನಂತರ ಕೆಲಸದ ಒತ್ತಡ ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಕಡಿಮೆ ಇದ್ದಾಗ, ಇವತ್ತು ಸೈಟು ನೋಡಲು ಹೋಗೋಣ ಶರವಣ ಅಂದೆ. ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ದಿನ ಇರಿ ಸರ್, ಶುಕ್ರವಾರ ಹೋಗುವ. ಯಾಕೆ, ಅದಕ್ಕೂ ಮುಹೂರ್ತ ಬೇಕೇನು? ತಮಾಷೆಯಾಗಿ ಕೇಳಿದೆ. ಹಾಗೇ ಅಂದುಕೊಳ್ಳಿ, ನೋಡಿ ನಿಮ್ಮ ವ್ಯವಹಾರ ಹೇಗೆ ಸರಾಗವಾಗಿ ಆಗಿ ಹೋಗುತ್ತದೆ. ಶುಕ್ರವಾರ ಸೈಟ್ ನೋಡಿದ್ದಾಯಿತು. ಅದನ್ನು ನೋಡಿದ್ದೆ, ಅಯ್ಯೋ ಇದು ದಕ್ಷಿಣಾಮುಖಿ ಎಂದು ಗೊತ್ತಿದ್ದರೆ ನಿಮ್ಮನ್ನು ಕರೆದುಕೊಂಡು ಬರುತ್ತಲೇ ಇರಲಿಲ್ಲ ಎಂದು ಶರವಣ ಚಡಪಡಿಸಿದ. ನನಗೆ ಸೈಟು ಪರವಾಗಿಲ್ಲ ಅನಿಸಿತು. ಶರವಣ ಮಾತ್ರ ಇದು ಬೇಡವೇ ಬೇಡ, ಬೇಕಾದರೆ ನಿಮಗೆ ಇದೇ ಬಡಾವಣೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಬೇರೆ ಕೊಡಿಸುತ್ತೇನೆ ಅಂದ.
ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು Vivek. I think we have time for 2-3 questions. We'll have to close.
Hello, sir. So, what I heard from what you told, among that, ನಂಗೆ ಅರ್ಥ ಆಯಿತು, ಕೆಲವೊಂದು ವರ್ಡ್ಗಳನ್ನ ನೀವು ಹೇಗಿದೆ ಅದು ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ಲೇಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದೆ ಆ ಕಥೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಅದೇ ಥರ ಬರೀತೀರಾ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರಲ್ಲ. Do you think we can't translate few words while we are writing a poem or story? And if so, why is it? Why do you think is it, sir?
I didn't say that. I didn't say.
ಕೆಲವೊಂದು ವರ್ಡ್ಗಳನ್ನ ಅದೇ ಥರ ಬರಿತೀವಿ, ಬಟ್ ಕಾರಣ ಏನಿರ್ಬೋದು ಸರ್ ಅದಕ್ಕೆ?
Okay. Then it is, see, every language has its, there are, when you use certain words, you can say from which part of Karnataka you are from, and there is a certain way in which you use the language, right? So the point I was trying to make is that if I use the same language as I was using in that phase of my life, like Chittal, it was easy to fall in that trap of Chittal's trap, and which is why I said I will write it differently so that I come out of his influence. That was my point, and not yeah. Thank you. I think we can. Yeah.
So since you come from both backgrounds of the corporate and writer's perspective, so how has corporate shaped your writing?
It is not. See, it is. All of us, every experience has an impact on us, whether you are a writer or you are not a writer. You have come here, spent a day, it has some impact on you. So similarly, it was like a job for me. So if I was a carpenter, it would have had some impact on my job. So it is very difficult to say that because I am a corporate, I worked in corporate, it does not mean, it has some impact, but it is very difficult to put one's finger and say that this is the impact I have had because I worked in corporate. But one thing is certain, that it gave me an exposure to a different world, which otherwise I would not have had. So one can say that about any profession, but since you asked about corporates, I can say that it gave me a very unique experience in different parts of the world.
I have a follow-up question, sir. Even though you have been a successful writer and you've been doing good things even in the corporate world, but haven't you ever thought about just pursuing your creative pursuits all time?
In fact, that's what I did. I quit my job many, many years ago to be a full-time writer.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sir.
Thank you. We couldn't come up to Vivek's most well-known work, Gachar Gochar, but I guess that's for another day. Thank you.